Welcome to episode 7 of the Minds of Murderers podcast, your home for factual true crime content focused around trying to highlight the person behind the crime. In this episode, we will look at the curious case of the boy who tried to have himself assassinated. The content featured in this podcast is of a sensitive nature, so viewer discretion is advised. The British intelligence agency, MI6, has been active in trying to covertly uncover threats to the nation and shut them down to avoid people coming to harm. This leads them to come into contact with all types of people from all walks of life. However, the MI6 is not as the movies would have you believe. Unlike James Bond, the real-life MI6 counterparts do not have a license to kill. Unfortunately, a young boy from Manchester was not aware of this fact as he plunged a knife into the chest of his close friend at the bidding of the spy organisation. Or at least that's what he thought. A 14-year-old boy, who was known in the court proceedings as John to protect his identity due to his young age, was a frequenter of internet chat rooms at the dawn of the millennia. John from Greater Manchester struck up a deep and intense friendship with 16-year-old Mark, also from Greater Manchester. The boys had a strange friendship that many would find hard to believe. This friendship took on a number of shocking twists and turns, culminating on their eventual meeting on Sunday, June 29th. The boys would meet up for a walk around Manchester town centre. Things seemed rather placid and normal at the start of their meeting as they explored the town and chatted. It wasn't until they took a detour down an alley that things began to go south. The boys claimed that a man dressed entirely in black jumped out at them. A struggle ensued, and in the tussle that followed, the man produced a knife which found its way into John's chest, deep enough to penetrate his ribcage, and then again into his abdomen. This second knife attack would see the knife pierce both John's liver and his kidney, leaving him in critical condition. The boys claimed that the attacker immediately fled the scene following this random attack, as Mark dialed 999 to urgently seek medical attention for his friend. The boys were the only witnesses to this savage random attack. By the time paramedics arrived, things did not look good for John, as his diaphragm was constricted due to the blood building up inside of his chest. The boy was rushed to the hospital as he clung on for life. Doctors and nurses took him in for emergency surgery and did everything within their power to save the boy. John died twice on the operating table as surgeons worked tirelessly to save him, which they did manage to do. The 14-year-old was alive, but just barely, still requiring a respirator to breathe. Manchester police interviewed Mark for details on the suspect. An older man dressed in a black hoodie and black jeans was the description provided. It wasn't much to go on, but a manhunt was begun nonetheless. Police asked the public for any information or sightings of the perpetrator fleeing the scene. No witnesses came forward. Nobody, except the boys, had been seen in that area. Detectives reviewed CCTV footage of the area that showed the entrance to the alleyway. Both John and Mark can be seen entering the alleyway, but nobody appears to have entered or left before or after them. The two boys were seemingly alone. 25 minutes after entering, Mark was seen leaving the alleyway to call 999 for medical assistance for his friend. Suddenly, the boy's story began to crumble. Officers travelled to the hospital John was staying in. At this point, he was well enough to speak. Detectives grilled John on his story, which seemed to change on each retelling. Eventually, he broke down and admitted it was his friend Mark that had stabbed him. Mark was arrested at his home on suspicion of attempted murder 4 weeks after the incident took place. Mark buckled under police interrogation and admitted to the stabbing. The case was all but closed. The police had the killer, but what they still didn't have was a motive. Mark claimed he heard voices in his head that compelled him to kill. This didn't sit right with the detectives investigating the case. If this was true, then why was John so reluctant to name his friend as the perpetrator during initial questioning? Something more must be at play. Officers began research into the boys' friendship. This led to the police force seizing the hard drives from the computers that both boys used to communicate with one another. It was at this point that things began to unravel as a spiralling web of lies and manipulation began to unfold. The police employed the skills of criminal intelligence analyst Sally Hogg, who was tasked with extracting as much information from the two hard drives as possible. She would scour through 58,000 lines of text and 133 gigabytes of data stored on the drives. Much of this text came from the chat room the boys were members of. 193 separate email addresses were found to have used this chat room, but the police found it difficult to track down any of the other users. Several months after the crime took place, John had been discharged from the hospital, and Mark was still behind bars. Both boys were regularly interviewed by police regarding the case without much progress. Finally, a name was produced that seemed to lead somewhere: Janet Dobinson. Janet Dobinson was a name the police had come across within the chat room. She was now a person of interest, and officers tried everything within their power to find Janet, or whoever was pretending to be Janet. The IP address associated with Janet Dobinson's username was tracked to a laptop, owned by John. It was later proved that Janet Dobinson's messages were only ever sent when John was in the house. Nobody could have been using John's laptop. Janet was John. This revelation sparked renewed interest into the chat room. As the analyst began to deconstruct the many conversations within the chat, one common misspelling became apparent. The word maybe was always misspelt as M-Y-B-Y-E. 192 of the 193 users in this chat spelt maybe this way. It became clear that Mark was the only other real user of the chat alongside John, and that Mark had been talking to a great number of John's aliases, one of them being Janet Dobinson. John came from a turbulent background. He never knew his father and was raised by his mother and a series of men she dated, but ultimately always split up with. His life was plagued with violence. One incident even involved John's biological father trying to abduct him. John, his mother and sister moved around the Manchester area quite a lot. This left John as a bit of a loner, preferring his own company. This instability did not heed John's educational prowess, as he qualified for the local grammar school. For his 13th birthday, his mother purchased him a laptop to aid in his studies. This opened up a new world for the boy. The internet became a place where he could be free, he could be whoever he wanted to be, and chat rooms soon became his new obsession, as John would sink as much time as he could into the various chat rooms. Eventually, he would be spending up to 12 hours a day talking to various strangers in chat rooms. This would begin to take its toll on John's real life, as his schoolwork suffered and his friendship would deteriorate as John became more and more withdrawn. This would lead to severe depression, which just worsened the situation. Things took a sharp turn for the worse a few months later, when John began experimenting with anonymous characters of his creation. One of these characters, Rachel, a 16-year-old girl from Manchester, would spark up a conversation with Mark. John, posing as Rachel, quickly developed a connection with Mark and schemed a way for him to become real friends with Mark. To do this, he told Mark that Rachel was his sister. Mark bought this lie, as he would many others that John would feed him. An arranged meetup between Mark and Rachel was set up several times, but obviously, due to her being fictional, Rachel never attended. Mark soon began to grow tired of being stood up, and John had to fabricate more backstory in order to keep Mark around. Kevin McGregory was a new character created by John to explain away Rachel's distance. McGregory was another active member of the little chat room community that the boys belonged to, who always wrote in pink, which was John's way of letting people know that he was gay, and was obsessed with Rachel. Mark was told that both John and Rachel were in danger of Kevin McGregory, as he'd been stalking Rachel and had made threats against them. McGregory began to make his threats known to Mark in order to blackmail him. John, posing as McGregory, convinced Mark to masturbate on webcam to him and show him his feet in order to save Rachel's life. However, John still needed a reason for Mark to not be able to meet Rachel, and so he pulled the trigger on a fictional abduction of Rachel by Kevin McGregory. Rachel disappeared for a while, to the shock of Mark. He had no idea where she had gone and was thinking the worst. His fears were confirmed when he received messages from McGregory telling him how he had kicked all her stomach, put her head under the freezing cold water, that she'd stained his sheets when she was bleeding, and disturbingly, he said, "You weren't there for her, no matter how much she screamed for you." This messed up Mark severely. He began to mourn his lost love, and his friendship with John became strained as a result. The boys talked less as Mark sank more and more time into himself. So John hatched a plan to do what he always did and lie himself out of his predicament. So he created Lindsay East, a new girl to the chat that took an interest in Mark. Once again, Mark would prove easy to manipulate and very quickly fell in love with Lindsay. History would repeat itself, and John would become jealous of the fake persona he had created, taking time away from his real persona, and once again had her killed. This time by the Secret Service. The lies were becoming more and more audacious and creative, but Mark still showed no signs of not believing them. Once again, Mark was suffering with the loss of his new love, and John knew that he needed to do something. So, he resurrected Mark's first love, Rachel. Concocting a story of Rachel being in a coma following her vicious assault and waking up to having given birth to Mark's baby. If alarm bells haven't been ringing up to this point, then they surely are now. John had fed Mark a lie about being the father of Rachel's child, despite the fact that he had never met her. However, Mark still believed the story he was being fed, which brings into question the intelligence level or mental stability of Mark during this period. Experts during the trial confirmed that Mark did not suffer from any conditions that would impair his mental faculties, but clearly something was at play here for Mark to so willingly stomach the most outrageous lies that he was being fed. Perhaps a defense mechanism for this young teen suffering through constant heartaches and stress. Rachel would soon drop off the grid as she had to stay in hiding, so John knew he needed to introduce something to occupy Mark's time. Janet Dobinson was the newest member of their little community. She had attracted Mark's attention, and unbeknownst to both boys, would be the character to bring the facade crashing down. Janet was a 43-year-old estate agent, older but still sexy. However, this was just a cover story, as she actually worked for the Secret Service, and told Mark that she was the third most important woman in Britain. Sometime into this newfound fabricated relationship, John was caught skiving off of school at Mark's house. Upon returning home, John's irate mother searched through his laptop to see what the boys had been up to, and stumbled across chat logs with Janet. She immediately contacted Mark's parents to voice concerns that they echoed, and both boys were instructed to stay well away from Janet and have no contact. To hammer her message home, John's mother broke his laptop by taking it apart and proceeded to do the same with the modem. This sudden withdrawal from his secret world took its toll on John, who became withdrawn and depressed. However, John would prove to be much more intelligent than his mother had realised, as he was able to rebuild and repair both his laptop and the modem without his mother's knowledge. Life progressed as usual for the following 6 weeks, before Janet asked Mark to work on a project for the Secret Service for her. Mark was asked to be a secret bodyguard for a teenager that worked for the Secret Services called James Bell. The teenager lived very close to Mark. That teenager was, of course, John. Mark was hesitant but eager to prove to his latest love that he was worth having sex with. Janet instructed Mark that he'd have to make John look gay by performing a sex act on him, and that if he didn't, she'd get sacked from her job as a secret agent. Mark stayed at John's house the following weekend. Now, this is a potential motive we have for John's behaviour. He was clearly obsessed with Mark due to all the characters and lies he created just to keep Mark within his orbit. It is possible that he had strong feelings for Mark, but knew that Mark would not reciprocate. After the weekend passed, the biggest twist of the tale would follow, when Janet told Mark that his best friend John had an inoperable brain tumour and was terminally ill. However, it wasn't that simple, as John was actually the richest boy on the planet, with a net worth of £568 billion, so his death would have far-reaching consequences for the nation. The funds were held in jewels, hidden in a safe at the bottom of the ocean, with only 2 people knowing the combination, John and the Queen. So Janet asked Mark for an ultimate test of loyalty. John, as Janet, asked Mark to kill John. A mercy killing, as he put it. Mark was obviously against the idea, saying, "Ain't it murder when you kill someone?" To which Janet replied that it would not be murder, as he had the explicit permission of the British Secret Service. Worryingly, Mark came on board with the idea relatively quickly. It is not clear what John intended here by setting up this scenario. Was he testing his control over Mark? Was he attempting to commit suicide in a roundabout way? Or was he simply lost in the fantasy world that he had created for his friend? The plan was for Mark to take John to the Trafford Centre, the largest shopping centre in Manchester, and to kill him in front of many witnesses. For this act, Mark would be paid £80 million, receive a thank you card from the Prime Minister, be hired by the Secret Services as an agent, and, most importantly to Mark, receive sexual favours from Janet. Mark was instructed on which knife to purchase after being told that his pocket knife was not good enough to get the job done. John would later open up to Mark about his brain tumour and provide evidence for Janet's story, leading Mark to take John to Manchester and stab him in the chest. Upon the discovery of these details, John was also arrested, and the simple case of a boy stabbing another became a much more complicated affair. Who was the victim and who was the perpetrator? John's lawyers had this to say: "We all remember the trauma of adolescence. The particular adolescent's behaviour, which brings my client before the court today, arises largely from his infatuation from his new internet friend. This young man admits frankly that he was not sure if he was gay or straight, and he fell in love with his new friend. He was sophisticated beyond his years, and the older boy was naive for his years." Judge David Madison said, "Skilled writers of fiction would struggle to conjure up a plot such as which arises here. It's staggering to be dealing with a case that arises out of a 14-year-old boy's invention of false personalities, false relationships, and even arranged for his own killing via an internet chat room. The case was unique, and both boys were a victim of each other. It was a folie à deux which could never happen again." Both boys were sentenced to light punishments given the circumstances, with a 3-year supervision order for John, no use of internet without supervision, as well as being banned for life from contacting Mark. Mark was sentenced to a 2-year supervision order. Due to British law not allowing under 18s to have their identities made known outside of special cases, neither Mark nor John's real names were ever published, so we cannot know how the two men are getting on now. We can only hope that both boys grew up to find the friendship and support that they clearly both craved and needed. Thanks for listening to episode 7 of the podcast. Following episode 8, we will return to posting weekly with a reintroduction of discussion episodes breaking down the details of the case in more detail, answering listener questions, and occasionally bringing on special guests to give their thoughts on the case. If you'd like to support myself, then please subscribe to me on YouTube at youtube.com/murderpediayt, or support the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/mindsofmurdererspodcast.